Fyodor Dostoevsky. I mean, just hearing the name, right? It conjures up these huge, dark novels, absolutely packed with tortured souls and these deep, philosophical questions. He's a true giant of world literature, for sure, but he's also famously difficult, with work that still kind of haunts and fascinates us well over a century after he died.
So where do you even start with a guy like that? Well, today we're going to dig into two really powerful and kind of competing ways to read Dostoevsky. Was he this orthodox prophet, warning everyone about the spiritual dangers of a world without God? Or was he something way stranger, a kind of plagiarist of the future, somehow writing about horrors he couldn't possibly have known?
To answer that, we've got to look at his work through two very different modern lenses. The first lens comes straight from his own intense religious conversion. But the other, it comes from this wild, mind-bending literary theory that asks us to, literally read him backwards.
Okay, so here's the plan. We're going to start with the one event that shaped his entire worldview, his brutal time in Siberia. Then we'll look at him as this orthodox prophet. After that, we'll get into that radical idea of reading him backwards. And finally, we'll pull it all together and see how both of these views point to a terrifying vision of a world without God.
Pretty much everything in Dostoevsky's work, it all really kicks off right here, in the fire of a Siberian prison camp. Before this, he was just a young writer, kind of into those Western socialist ideas. But after, he was a completely different person.
So how in the world did he end up there? Well, it all started back in 1848. He joined this secret group of radical students. Turns out, that was a huge mistake. He gets arrested and put through this absolutely horrifying mock execution. I mean, can you imagine? He genuinely thought he was moments from death, and then, at the last second, they tell him his sentence is only 4 years of hard labor in a katorga, a vicious prison camp. The book he wrote about it, The House of the Dead, would go on to change Russian literature forever.
And the shock of it all was just immense. You have to remember, Dostoevsky was a nobleman, a dvoryanin, and then suddenly he's thrown into what his biographer called a world of moral horror. He's surrounded by actual murderers and violent felons who hated him just for his social class. He had to deal with sadistic guards, backbreaking work, and just this constant gnawing dread.
The whole experience was so unbelievably hellish that his famous contemporary, the novelist Ivan Turgenev, reads one particular scene in The House of the Dead and could only describe it as simply Dantesque. He was literally comparing it to Dante's Inferno. That really tells you everything you need to know about the trauma that would become the bedrock of all his greatest writing.
All right, so let's check out our first lens and see how this all connects. Because out of all that suffering came a powerful new vision. Dostoevsky, the orthodox prophet.
That time in the Karga didn't just change him, it absolutely shattered his old beliefs. He walked out of that prison a new man, completely and totally converted to the truth of Russian Orthodoxy. And from then on, he saw it as his life's mission to use his talent to defend that faith against the very same Western secular ideas he used to admire.
And you can see this mission so clearly in his big novels. The Possessed is this chilling deep dive into the revolutionary mind, and it predicts with this spooky accuracy the millions who would die in a future Russian revolution. Crime and Punishment follows a soul that's been consumed by nihilism, only to find salvation through Christianity. And his final masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, is just this epic defense of orthodoxy against what he saw as its Western corruption.
But look, this wasn't the faith of some perfect saint. Dostoevsky was a deeply passionate guy who wrestled with his own demons his entire life. A famous spiritual leader at the time, Elder Ambrose, met him and just summed him up perfectly. He said Dostoevsky wasn't a righteous man, he was one who is repenting. It was that raw, personal struggle that made his religious vision so incredibly powerful.
So that's the traditional way to look at Dostoevsky. It makes sense, right? But what if there's another way? A way that sees his work not just as a warning about spiritual decay, but as a prophecy of a very real, very physical horror.
And that brings us to our second, and honestly much weirder lens, this literary concept that asks us to literally read Dostoevsky backwards.
So the official term is anticipatory plagiarism. I know, it's a mouthful, but it's a really playful and powerful idea. It basically suggests we can understand a classic author in a totally new way by reading their work as if it was influenced by a book written long after they were dead. Yeah, it's all about flipping the arrow of time to see what new patterns emerge.
Okay, so let's see how this actually works. We're going to compare Dostoevsky's House of the Dead from 1862 with a novel from 2015, Guzel Yakhina's Zuleika. Now, the contexts are just worlds apart. Dostoevsky's book is about his time in a Tsarist camp with actual convicted criminals. Yakhina's book, which is based on her own grandmother's life, is about the Stalinist Gulag, where the prisoners were innocent victims of a political ideology. So even though they were written 150 years apart about completely different systems, the similarities are just staggering. Both are set in Siberian exile, both are about the raw daily fight for survival against an oppressive state, both feature this diverse community of prisoners from all walks of life, and crucially, both are based on deeply personal, real-life experiences.
So when you read Dostoevsky's 19th century novel through Yakhina's 21st century one, it's a fascinating experience. His old memoir about a Tsarist prison camp suddenly transforms. It starts to feel like this eerie, unintentional prophecy of the much bigger, much more systematic cruelty of the 20th century Gulag. It's almost as if he plagiarized the future.
So, we have two versions of Dostoevsky, the Orthodox prophet and the plagiarist of the future. How can he possibly be both? Well, the answer lies in one single, terrifying idea that haunted him for his entire life. Here it is. Years and years before Nietzsche famously grappled with the death of God, Dostoevsky put this idea right at the center of his work. If there is no God, if there is no soul, then everything is permitted. There are no moral rules. Anything goes. And that is the thread that ties our two lenses together. You see, as the Orthodox prophet, Dostoevsky was warning that this idea would lead to spiritual chaos. And as the plagiarist of the future, his work gives us this shockingly accurate picture of what that chaos looks like in the real world. The ideology-driven cruelty of the Gulag, a system built on the principle that to build a new society, everything is permitted. So in the end, whether you see him as a prophet talking about the human soul or as some kind of accidental historian of the future, you end up in the exact same place. Both ways of reading him reveal an author who is obsessed with one single question. What happens to us as people and as a society when we lose our moral compass? Which leaves us with a final, kind of provocative thought. Dostoevsky was trying to make sense of his own time, his own terrible suffering. But by reading him backwards, we see our own history staring back at us from his pages. And it really makes you wonder, when we read the great works of the past, are we telling their story? Or are we really just trying to find a way to tell our own?